In today's episode, we explore the fading glow of liberalism, the rise of populism, and the existential questions posed by technological revolution.
Okay, let's jump right into it. For this deep dive, we've been immersing ourselves in Yuval Noah Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, specifically the chapter called Disillusionment. And it feels like a really crucial text for grappling with the feeling of chaos and uncertainty that's so prevalent right now.
It really does. And Harari starts by making a fundamental point, doesn't he? He says humans don't just live by facts, but by stories.
Stories, yeah.
Simple narratives that help us make sense of the world, explain the past, and, predict the future. And for much of the 20th century, global elites had three big ones that seemed to explain everything.
Right, those three grand stories.
Yeah.
Fascism, communism, and liberalism.
Exactly. And after World War II, the fascist story was thankfully,
Yeah,
defeated.
gone.
So for the next few decades, it was this intense global struggle, wasn't it? A real battle of ideas between communism and liberalism.
A two-horse race,
Yeah.
essentially. Yeah. And then, seemingly overnight, communism collapsed. And for a good few years there, it genuinely felt like the liberal story had won.
Oh, definitely. It became the dominant narrative worldwide.
And this narrative, as Harari lays it out, is built on the idea of liberty. The belief that for most of history, people lived under oppressive rulers, but gradually, freedom gained ground.
So, like, democracies replacing dictatorships.
Exactly. Free enterprise thriving, individuals starting thinking for themselves, and it got easier to move people, ideas, and goods across borders, that whole package.
You see this summed up in what the book calls the liberal panacea, this widespread belief. I mean, even shared by people like George W. Bush and Barack Obama,
Yeah, quite different figures, but they agreed on this.
that if countries would just liberalize their politics and economies and embrace globalization, everyone would become peaceful and prosperous.
It was almost like a formula, wasn't it?
Yeah, the idea was if you joined the liberal march, you'd be rewarded. If you resisted, you were simply on the wrong side of history.
Right, like Bill Clinton famously told China back in the 90s.
So it makes you wonder, doesn't it? If this liberal story seems so completely triumphant just a couple of decades ago, what happened?
Uh-huh. Why are people suddenly so disillusioned? And crucially, what's starting to fill that void, especially when you add the incredible disruptive force of modern technology into the mix.
That's really the puzzle we're tackling here, I think.
Yeah.
So let's try to understand that fading glow. Harari points to the global financial crisis in 2008 as a major catalyst.
Yes, that financial crisis really exposed cracks in the system many people thought was invincible, a real shock.
You could feel his shift then.
And after 2008, you started seeing the symptoms pop up everywhere. Barriers, both literal walls and digital firewalls, started going up.
Right, more resistance to immigration, global trade deals.
And you see governments, even in countries considered democracies, kind of chipping away at the independence of the judiciary or the freedom of the press.
Not just fringe places either.
No. And of course, the rise of illiberal democracies or outright strongman rule in places like Turkey and Russia became much more prominent.
And this leads us to a key moment the book highlights.
Yeah.
2016.
Yeah, 2016. That's when this disillusionment really hit the core liberal heartlands, with the Brexit vote in the UK and the election of Donald Trump in the US.
Huge shocks to the system.
And it's fascinating how Harari breaks down the reasons behind this shift. For some, it was a realization that they actually preferred the old, more hierarchical world.
The privileges that came with it.
Yeah, whether those were based on race, nationality, or gender, they weren't ready to let go of those advantages. For others, the conclusion was different, that globalization and liberalization were fundamentally rigged.
Just a racket, basically.
A racket designed to enrich a tiny global elite at the expense of ordinary people. That was the feeling.
And this leads to a pretty stark observation from Harari. He says in 1938, we had three major global stories. By 1968, after WWII, it was down to two.
Communism and liberalism.
In 1998, with the fall of communism, it felt like just one remained.
The winner.
But by 2018, he argues, we're effectively down to zero.
Zero. And that absence of a clear story is incredibly disorienting, especially for liberal elites who felt so certain just a short time ago.
You can imagine the whiplash.
Yeah, Harari likens it to being completely lost, nothing making sense anymore.
Yeah.
Like the Soviet elite after the USSR collapse, they're grappling with why history didn't follow the script they expected.
And that confusion, he says, can lead to really apocalyptic thinking.
Right, the fear that if the planned happy ending isn't happening, the only alternative must be total disaster. He uses the analogy of mistaking a bad headache for a terminal brain tumor.
Oh.
The fear surrounding events like Brexit and Trump felt, to some, like the end of human civilization itself, a bit over the top maybe, but reflecting that deep disorientation.
So let's connect this sense of disorientation to another huge force shaping our world,
Mm.
the acceleration of technology.
Mm.
The book suggests the liberal political system we have, which was essentially built for the industrial era, the age of steam engines and broadcast TV, is completely struggling to cope.
It's just not built for the speed, is it? The current speed of the information technology and biotechnology revolutions.
How can it? How can politicians, and by extension, the voters they represent, possibly grasp or regulate these new technologies when they're evolving so rapidly?
Well, exactly. Harari points out that the internet revolution, for example, was driven by engineers, not political leaders.
Yeah, did you ever vote on the internet?
Exactly. Did you personally ever get to vote on whether or how the internet would be developed? The democratic process is still playing catch up.
And it seems utterly unequipped for what's coming next, like the massive implications of AI or the blockchain revolution.
Think about finance. It's already so complex because computers handle most of it. Harari raises the possibility that AI could soon reach a point where no human mind can fully make sense of the global financial system.
Wow. What does that do to our political systems?
Yeah.
Can you imagine a government needing an algorithm's approval for its budget?
It sounds like sci-fi, but it's a serious question. And technologies like blockchain, the system behind cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin, have the potential to fundamentally reshape money itself.
Which would require radical tax reforms.
Yeah.
Maybe even figuring out how to tax information itself.
Yeah, he floats that idea. Can our political system adapt to that before the financial basis of government fundamentally changes? It's a race against time, maybe?
But the really game-changing shift, according to the book, is that the infotech and biotech revolutions aren't just changing the economy or society.
No, they could restructure us, our very bodies and minds.
Okay, explain that.
Historically, humans have focused on controlling the external world-building dams, setting up irrigation, developing medicine to kill diseases like malaria transmitted by mosquitoes, things outside ourselves.
Right, external problem.
But we had limited control over our inner world. We couldn't stop aging, design a specific type of brain, or figure out how to simply switch off an unwanted thought.
And here's where it gets fascinating. Harari suggests these technologies are opening the door to precisely that kind of internal control.
Yes. We might gain the ability to engineer life itself, design our own brains, vastly extend lifespans, and even directly influence or kill thoughts and emotions at will.
That sounds potentially terrifying.
Well, history shows us humans have always been far better at inventing powerful tools than at using them wisely.
That's true.
Just as we manipulated the external world without truly understanding complex ecosystems leading to environmental collapse, we might start manipulating our inner world without fully understanding our own minds.
Leading to mental breakdown.
Potentially, a kind of internal psychological breakdown on a mass scale. It's a possibility Harari takes very seriously.
And meanwhile, these revolutions are largely being driven by engineers, entrepreneurs, scientists.
People often focus purely on the technical possibilities, barely thinking about the immense political and social ramifications.
And you see that disconnect. Harari notes that technological disruption wasn't even a central issue in recent political debates. He points to the 2016 U.S. presidential election.
Yeah, the main political discussion around disruptive tech was about Hillary Clinton's emails.
Right. While there was talk about job losses, neither candidate truly grappled with the scale of automation. Trump talked about building a wall to stop Mexicans taking jobs.
And penalizing China.
But he didn't warn voters about algorithms taking jobs or propose a digital firewall on the border with California, as Harari puts it.
That disconnect is huge, and it might explain a lot of the loss of faith, even in the liberal heartlands. Ordinary people might not be fluent in AI or biotech jargon.
No, of course not.
But they sense something huge is happening, and crucially, they sense the future might be leaving them behind.
That's a powerful feeling. The book contrasts this with a feeling in the 20th century where common people were told they were the very heroes of the future.
Yeah, seeing themselves depicted prominently in propaganda posters. I am in that poster. I am the hero.
Whereas the feeling in 2018, as Harari describes it, it's increasingly one of irrelevance.
Exactly. Buzzwords like AI, blockchain, genetic engineering, and they don't feel like they're about you. The liberal story, at its heart, was the story of ordinary individuals exercising their liberty and agency.
So how does that story adapt to a future maybe dominated by cyborgs and networked algorithms.
That's the question. So instead of the 20th century struggle where masses revolted against exploitation, they had an economic role, and they wanted the political power to match it.
Yeah.
Harari argues we might be seeing masses who fear irrelevance, who are desperate to use the political power they still possess before the accelerating technological changes strip even that away.
That perspective certainly puts support for things like Brexit and Trump into a different light.
It really does. It suggests it's partly driven by people who have political power but fear their economic worth is about to disappear.
So it's a struggle against irrelevance.
Which the book suggests is far harder psychologically and politically than fighting against exploitation. It's a much deeper fear.
So with all this, is the liberal story truly doomed? The book reminds us that liberalism has stared down existential crises before.
Oh, absolutely. Think about the period around World War I, sometimes called the Franz Ferdinand moment, when the old order collapsed. Then the 1930s and 40s, the Hitler moment, when fascism seemed terrifyingly unstoppable.
Right.
And the Cold War era, the Che Guevara moment, when communism looked like the wave of the future to many around the globe.
And each time, liberalism didn't just survive.
No, Harari argues, but actually emerged stronger, in part by cleverly adopting and integrating some of its opponents' best ideas.
Like what?
Well, it learned from communism, for instance, about the importance of equality alongside liberty and started expanding its circle of empathy.
Ah, okay. Because initially, liberalism was pretty exclusive, wasn't it? Mainly focused on the rights and freedoms of middle-class European men.
Very much so. It was often blind to the suffering of workers, women, minorities, non-Western populations. The book points out the hypocrisy.
Yeah.
Britain and France talking about liberty after WWI while brutally suppressing independence movements in India, or the Dutch fighting for Indonesian independence from the Nazis while simultaneously fighting against Indonesian independence for themselves.
Right. The contradictions were stark.
But gradually, the liberal narrative did broaden, at least in theory, to include the rights of all humans. And it incorporated the idea of the welfare state, recognizing that liberty means less if you don't have basic security.
So, by the early 1990s, with that famous end of history idea floating around,
Yeah, Fukion.
the refurbished liberal package combining democracy, human rights, free markets, and welfare provisions seemed poised to just sweep the world.
Erase borders, unite humanity. That was the dream.
But obviously, history didn't end. And now we're in what the book calls the Trump moment.
And Harari suggests this crisis feels different.
How so?
Because the challenge isn't coming from a coherent, attractive alternative ideology like fascism or communism. It seems more, well, nihilistic.
Nihilistic.
Yeah, he argues that people who supported Trump or Brexit didn't necessarily reject the entire liberal package, just its globalizing component. They might still like democracy or free markets.
But they want those ideas to stop at the border.
Exactly. Even if it means adopting illiberal policies towards foreigners, supposedly for domestic benefit. Nationalism trumps globalism.
And it's fascinating to compare this to other major players. China, for example.
Seems almost a mirror image, doesn't it? Very cautious about domestic political liberalization, but much more liberal on a global stage when it comes to trade and international cooperation.
Harari even suggests Xi Jinping seems, in some ways, like the true successor to Obama in his globalist outlook.
It's a provocative thought. Russia, meanwhile, is presented as ideologically bankrupt, essentially an oligarchic system that uses state-controlled media to blame others and manufacture crises.
Using historical grievances, strongman posturing.
Right. The book cites Lincoln's quote about manufacturing facts and points to Russia's extreme wealth inequality, with 87% of the wealth held by the richest 10%.
And you see the lack of widespread appeal for these alternatives, don't you? Harari points out that people vote with their feet.
Millions still want to emigrate to places like the U.S., Germany, Canada, Australia.
The liberal West, basically.
Yeah. A smaller number might consider China or Japan, but, as he puts it, he's yet to meet anyone who dreams of moving to Russia.
And similarly with global Islam.
While it appeals strongly to those born into it, he contrasts the small number of young Muslims from Germany going to the Middle East with the potentially hundreds of Middle Eastern youth who want to move to liberal Germany.
So this raises a question. Is the current crisis less severe than past ones? Precisely because there's no clearly attractive, coherent, alternative global story out there.
It's possible. Maybe in the absence of anything compelling, people will eventually just drift back towards liberalism out of sheer necessity or lack of options.
Or, perhaps, instead of a new global story, people are retreating entirely from the global stage.
And seeking comfort in local, nostalgic, nationalist, and religious fantasies? Yeah, Harari explores that too.
He contrasts this with 20th century nationalism, which still usually operated within some kind of global framework or ideology.
Right, they wanted independent states, but looked outward for their worldview. The current trend, he suggests, fills the vacuum left by liberalism with backward-looking dreams of a local golden past.
And you see examples of this everywhere. Trump's Make America Great Again, obviously.
Brexit proponents dreaming of splendid isolation in a hyper-connected world. China tapping into imperial and Confucian legacies. Putin resurrecting symbols of the Tsarist Empire.
Similar trends in India, Poland, Turkey.
And the book highlights the extreme versions in the Middle East, with Islamists wanting to reinstate systems from 1400 years ago.
And Israeli fundamentalists openly talking about returning to 2,500-year-old biblical times, expanding borders, reinstating ancient law, rebuilding the temple.
It's pretty striking when you lay it all out.
It's understandable why liberal leaders, like President Obama in his final UN speech in 2016, look at this turn inward with alarm.
He warned against retreating into a world sharply divided by nation, tribe, race, and religion.
He argued, and the book implicitly agrees by pointing to liberalism's track record, that liberal principles, for all their flaws, have been the best foundation humanity has found so far.
And you can point to the results: relative peace, widespread prosperity, dramatic improvements in health statistics.
Where things like infectious disease, famine, and violent conflict now kill far fewer people than old age, obesity, and accidents.
Yeah.
That's a huge shift.
It is. However, the book is clear about where liberalism fundamentally fails in the face of current challenges.
Okay, where?
It has no real answers for the twin threats of ecological collapse and technological disruption.
Because liberalism has traditionally relied on the idea of continuous economic growth.
Exactly. Just make the pie bigger and everyone benefits, reducing conflict. But growth is a primary cause of the ecological crisis.
And the technological revolution is built on the promise of accelerating growth and disruption. It's a catch-22.
Precisely. Which means expectations have to shift dramatically. Past generations could realistically expect their lives to be better than their parents' lives, thanks to economic growth.
But future generations,
due to the combined pressures of ecology and disruptive tech, might be fortunate just to maintain their current living standards. Or even slip back.
that's a profound change in outlook.
So Harari concludes, the critical task facing humankind is creating a new, updated story for the world.
A new narrative.
Yeah. Just as the upheaval of the Industrial Revolution demanded new ideologies like socialism and modern liberalism, the biotech and infotech revolutions absolutely require fresh visions.
And liberalism somehow reinvent itself yet again?
Maybe. Or can traditional nationalism or religion provide meaningful answers? Or is a completely new story necessary, one that moves beyond the familiar frameworks of liberty and equality?
These are huge questions.
Huge. And right now, we seem to be stuck in what the book describes as a nihilist moment of disillusionment and anger.
We've lost faith in the old stories, but we haven't found or embraced a new one yet.
Yeah. And Harari suggests that instead of panicking, perhaps a more productive and honest approach is simply bewilderment.
Bewilderment.
The humble admission that I just don't understand what's going on. Acknowledging the confusion might be the first step to clarity.
Okay.
And the ultimate test for any potential future story, he argues, will be its ability to genuinely grapple with the immense changes coming from the infotech and biotech revolutions.
It needs to make sense of and incorporate things like AI, big data, and bioengineering into a coherent, meaningful narrative for humanity.
And it needs to do it relatively soon, perhaps by 2050. The clock is ticking.
And to bring this back to something really concrete and personal, the book highlights the job market.
Yes.
The very real prospect of widespread technological unemployment and the creation of what Harari calls a massive new useless class.
It's a harsh term, but captures the fear.
It is. And it's perhaps the single most impactful consequence of these technological changes that no existing ideology has a clear answer for.
Which is precisely why talking about jobs instantly grabs people's attention.
Right. It taps into that fundamental fear of irrelevance and lack of purpose that arises directly from these seemingly abstract technological shifts.
Definitely.
So we've traced the path from the apparent triumph of the liberal story to its current crisis, explored how rapidly advancing technology acts as a massive disruptive force.
seeing how this contributes to fears of irrelevance and fuels populist responses.
And noted the resulting vacuum of any clear, compelling alternative narrative, leaving us in this state of collective bewilderment.
Yeah, that sums it up pretty well. And the central challenge that Harari leaves us with, derived from this deep dive into the source material, is that humankind urgently needs a new story.
And its ultimate validity won't be philosophical, but practical.
Its capacity to make sense of and integrate the profound transformations being wrought by AI and biotechnology. That's the test.
And thinking about that potential for mass technological unemployment and the creation of a useless class that the source points out as a key consequence. Harari asks whether any current political story, whether it's liberalism, nationalism, religion, or something we haven't even conceived of yet, can actually offer a meaningful place or purpose for potentially billions of people in the coming decades.
It's a heavy question.
What does that possibility mean for you personally? And given that challenge, what kind of future story do you think feels necessary or even possible? Something to really think about.